Hello, everyone. I'm Rorry Daniels, Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program, Crossfire to Ceasefire, Navigating India-Pakistan Tensions. We're meeting at a time today in late May 2025 when the tensions between India and Pakistan over the disputed Kashmir region have become quite hot. Military actions have been taken by both sides, and both sides are tentatively in a place now where de escalation is occurring. And to unpack those developments and to think about this in a larger regional and historical context, we've brought together three excellent experts. We have with us Ambassador Cameron Munter, former US Ambassador to Pakistan and Serbia, former president of the EastWest Institute. We have our Senior Director of our ASPI Delhi office, Akshay Mathur, who is an expert in geoeconomics and regional dynamics. And we have our Director of South Asia Initiatives, Farwa Aamer, who's been following these developments from New York. Farwa, I want to start with you. As I said, you've been monitoring these developments closely here at ASPI. And to help us kind of set the context, why don't you take us through the recent developments after the Pagalum attack that took India and Pakistan dangerously close to the brink of war? How did this particular incident differ in terms of its intensity or character to bring us to where we are today?
Thank you, Rory. Pleasure to be here. Sure. So it's been a tense few weeks. The immediate trigger was the deadly terrorist attack in Pahalgam on April 22nd that India quickly attributed to Pakistan-based elements pointing to cross-border linkages. Pakistan categorically denied involvement. Meanwhile, the Resistant Front, which is a proxy group India sees as aligned with Lashkar-e-Taiba, reportedly claimed responsibility online, but nothing has been officially confirmed since. Now, what followed was a rapid breakdown in bilateral relations. India's response was swift and sweeping. It took the unprecedented step of placing the Indus Waters Treaty in abeyance, something that hasn't happened even during past wars. That alone signaled a significant shift from what we have witnessed previously. India also suspended the SARC visa exemption scheme for Pakistanis, cut diplomatic staffing on both sides, and shut down the Atari Wagah border, which was the only functional land crossing between the two countries. Now, each of these moves closed off a channel that had long been part of the thin connective tissue between the two countries. Pakistan responded in kind, suspending trade, including via third countries, canceling similarly SARC visa exemption for Indians, closing its airspace for Indian owned and operated airlines, and most notably, warning that any disruption to Indus River flows would be treated as an act of war. They also announced that they shall exercise the right to hold the 1972 similar agreement in abeyance, which underpins the line of control or the de facto border between the two countries and had laid out core principles for future engagements on disputes. At this point, the crisis had already drawn global concern. The likes of the United States, China, G70 countries, and the United Nations Security Council all called for calm and restraint. China had also backed Pakistan's call for a neutral, impartial probe into Pahalgam terror attack to verify these allegations. But despite there were ongoing cross-border skirmishes and risks of further escalations were rising. Then came last week, May 7th. India launched Operation Sindoor, which it framed as a preemptive, proportionate, and non escalatory operation aimed specifically at targeting infrastructure linked to cross border terrorism. The goal, as per Indian officials, was deterring further terror attacks. Pakistan saw these attacks as unprovoked, citing civilian casualties on its side, and retaliated very quickly. And the two sides were then locked in a cycle of retaliatory air and drone strikes, deeper into each other's territory than in past confrontations. It was once India struck Pakistan's Noor Khan Air Base, a site which is viewed as strategically sensitive due to its proximity to elements of the country's nuclear command structure. Things became a lot more serious in nature. In response, Pakistan launched Operation Bunyan Marsus, directly targeting key Indian military installations. By this point, we had reached what was beyond what we saw in 2016 or 2019, which were some of the recent escalations between the two countries. The tempo, the depth, and the political signaling were all sharper, and there were real concerns that we were inches away from a miscalculation that neither side could afford, given the nuclear capabilities involved. What made this worse was the fog of misinformation, claims and counterclaims, media noise, and no reliable flow of verified facts that created a lot of volatility, not just on the ground, but in how each side perceives the other's moves and wins and losses. Who shot down what were the damages to the sites? Nothing was really getting verified. So, what we saw in the lead up to the ceasefire over the weekend brokered by the United States was a collapse of restraint, the erosion of crisis management tools, and a willingness on both sides to push past established boundaries. What we are now left with is a situation that may have paused but hasn't truly stabilized. The guardrails have been tested and in some cases broken, and that makes the next crisis not just likely but potentially much harder to control.
Thank you for that. I think it is really important to underline that some of these dynamics and the chance of miscalculation is made a lot worse by the environment, the media environment that we're living in, where rumors and conjecture can sometimes get as much press time, airtime, as concrete facts on the ground. And of course, this is particularly salient and dangerous when you have two nuclear powers facing off against each other. Akshay, I want to turn to you now. I'd like to hear from your perspective how you were assessing the situation on the ground in India, particularly during the period of the intense crisis. What were some of the signals or indicators that you were watching from India's perspective that helped you assess how far the crisis might go? Did you see an opening for de escalation or for an external mediation at the rate and pace that things were unfolding?
Rory, I think the terrorist attack that took place in Pahalgam was this time was also a little different in nature. In numbers, 26 people were killed, and this was the largest civilian casualty since the 2008 attack in Mumbai. So it was different, and also it was different in the way it was carried out. The terrorists came out in the open. They asked the tourists for their religion, and they shot the Hindus, in some cases in front of their spouses, in some cases in front of their children, and they left their family members alive, so that encouraging them, in fact, to go and recount the horror to different government of India officials and to the media. So there was outrage in India of a different kind. That was palpable to anybody, let alone experts such as ourselves who follow international affairs. Therefore, the revenge against terrorists and whether there was going to be some action, I think that was obvious. The large parts of Indian society and policy-making circuit were uh, uh, asking the government to take immediate response. So this was not just about Pakistan occupied Kashmir. This had become about terrorism. And I think over time, over the course of last week, the government has reiterated how this has become about terrorism, not just about the region. And the government started signaling on how they are going to respond to this. So, as Farwa mentioned, the Indus Water Treaty was put into abeyance. Now, this is the first time that has been done, and where water has been directly linked to terrorism and India's response to such acts. Second, the precision strikes, I think, that were seen here by the government, but also by the citizens as somewhat measured. It seemed like it was directed at terrorist infrastructure and that it was a proportionate response from the Indian government. After the first set of precision strikes, because you asked the question, I think there was a moment where, at least in India, we thought there was a moment where this might pause and that there might be time for reconciliation or a ceasefire or dialogue. But that did not happen. Of course, it went the other way. I do want to emphasize that I think the Indus Water Treaty, which has now been put in abeyance, I think that seems irreversible at this point, and has going to directly impact citizens, particularly in Pakistan, but also has economic costs. And so we will have to analyze what the implications of putting a shared water treaty in abeyance is going to be. At least here in India, the government has emphasized that they have overcome the fear, or they've also been referring to it as a bluff for a nuclear response. So I think that's the second big change as far as the Indian government's response is concerned. And finally, I think that the Prime Minister made a statement, yes, on one of the speeches, saying that terror and talks can't go together, and water and blood can't flow together. So you can imagine that this particular series of exchanges and what has happened over the course of last week, or rather since the attack in Pahalgam, has been absorbed quite differently by the current government. I sense that there were equal number of people in India that were hoping that some reasoning would come through, and that it would not escalate beyond a point. And I think a large part of the society is satisfied that there was some response from India, perhaps a little bit more than what we have done in the past, in gunning down the terrorists that have been responsible. So let me just stop there, and I think I can come back to it if there are other questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're happy to unpack a little bit more the significance of the Indus Water Treaty and what it means a little later in this program. But for now, I want to turn to Ambassador Munter. Ambassador, throughout this crisis, we saw U.S. Secretary of State Rubio actively engaging with New Delhi and with Islamabad, signaling the U.S. interest in de-escalation. But for much of the crisis, it wasn't clear how active and directly involved Washington would become in helping the two sides come to at least a pause in the military action. In your experience, what do you think prompted the U.S. to treat the situation with urgency and shift from what seemed like concern to active mediation? And how have you seen the U.S. backchannel engagement work in times of crisis such as this?
Well, yes, I think that we're dealing with a new kind of American government. We're dealing with people who are in the process of a restructuring that's very major at State Department and the intelligence agencies, et cetera. So it's very difficult to get insights into how the actual mechanics of how the United States is doing this kind of thing work. But in terms of policy, there has been an inconsistency. There's been a general sense from Washington that India is in broad sense, that India is a priority, and a general sense that Pakistan is not. That is, since Pakistan is no longer linked in the mind of American planners as part of an Afghan-Pakistan problem as it was seen in previous years, there was a sense up until this crisis that India was a focus and Pakistan was not. For that reason, you get the impression, or I get the impression, I would say, and others in Washington have said, that there's an inconsistency as evinced by what J.D. Vance said, this is not our problem, or a kind of an impulse that you get from the president, which is, this is dangerous, we have to engage, we have to seek peace. So the fact that the United States was probably not prepared and does not have a strategy for the region implies to me that there was a response that was very ad hoc and that was very personalized. And again, I'm basing this on very secondhand information because I'm not in the government anymore. So it was very personalized, and it did not take into account any strategic long-term objectives of the United States other than the idea that they should stop the fighting so this shouldn't get out of control. I think one of the things that we saw after the ceasefire was announced by the Americans, not by either of the other two countries, was a certain amount of resentment from the Indian side that there were statements that the president made in social media that he would be happy to engage on the underlying issues such as the international agreements or calls for international agreements to solve Kashmir. Well, there's a long history of Pakistan trying to internationalize the Kashmir issue, and India saying, no, this is a bilateral issue and the rest of the world has no business dealing with it. And so the fact that the Americans seemed to jump in and say, we want to mediate without apparently having a strategy or having done their homework and having studied what's happened in Kashmir in international fora since the 1940s, I think was uncomfortable for a number of people in India. In Pakistan, the sense was that that you have also some issues that the military is working through as it adjusts to some of the domestic issues in the country that were probably not in the front of the mind of the United States. So I guess what I would conclude in this is that I think it was probably a very ad hoc effort, an impulse rather than a strategy, a personalized kind of engagement rather than a systematic element by diplomats, and whether or not they made use of unofficial back channels, that's simply something I don't know, and I'm not sure if that's public at this point.
Fantastic. Thank you for walking us through your assessment of the U.S. involvement here. I can certainly see how, from India's perspective, it's very uncomfortable to have that kind of ad hoc approach come in for an issue that's so critically important to the government. But in many ways, although it's very understandable for India to want this to be a bilateral issue, of course, when military action starts occurring, there are other actors who are interested and involved. And not just the United States. There's also, a strong China element to this crisis as well. There are reports that it was that some Chinese-made drones were involved in the attacks from Pakistan into Indian territory. And there are a lot of actors, influential international actors, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, engaging quite actively. From your perspective, how are these actors viewing their roles in the stability of the subcontinent? And what are the actions that perhaps these other actors have taken? Tell us about their evolving influence and interests in creating stability and peace in South Asia.
One of the differences that I sense from the time when I was an active diplomat, which is more than a decade ago, and the present, is that there was an overarching sense, even when we, the Americans, would talk to our Chinese colleagues, an overarching interest in seeing a broad understanding of common interests. There were times when I was ambassador in Islamabad where I would go with the Chinese ambassador to talk to the Pakistani officials to try to make sure that this was seen as a broad kind of set of issues that we all cared about. I have the impression at this point, what is different is that the transactionalism that is associated with Donald Trump and with the American government is also something that is whether by default or just by chance, kind of working for the other countries as well. Take the examples of Iran, which has a number of crises that it's facing right now. Turkey, which is seeing its position alter in the Middle East and seeing itself emerge as an important player. These kinds of countries are looking for where their particular transactional advantage could play out. It is not clear to me that they have a broad, overarching sense of responsibility for peace in the region or a vision of any overarching peace in the region, but rather that they see individual opportunities both for advancement but also for great danger, and that they're approaching it in this way. What I find conceptually different about this crisis from my memory of previous crises is that it is a number of different people looking from the outside rather than an overarching sense that there is an issue that India and Pakistan have to deal with that might lead to some sort of long-term stability. In this sense, I very much agree with Farwa that even though the tensions have abated, and even though there may be indications that on both sides that the civilians are very relieved, that this has taken place. The way in which the international community is dealing with this issue is very different and, to me, very unstable.
Yes, absolutely. I think that we will have to continue to follow this crisis to see how international actors will end up promoting their positions or promoting their national interests within the context of obviously what is a volatile situation on the ground. Akshay, I'd like to turn to you to talk a little bit about the economics. So President Trump remarked on Monday that trade was one of the key levers pushing both countries towards a ceasefire and suggesting that a continued action could have jeopardized US Indian official talks on trade. But of course, the Indian officials have denied trade being on the table. But this does come at a time when India is in the middle of negotiating a major bilateral trade agreement with the United States, when Pakistan itself is having its own economic engagement with the US and international financial institutions. From your perspective, how significant could have been the potential economic cost of prolonging this country or crisis for both countries? And do you think that an assessment of the economic cost played a role in the de-escalation that occurred?
Might have seen that at least the Indian government has already denied that trade was part of the conversation. And uh, in several other conversations with Indian government officials, it has become clear that the economic rationale or economic repercussions were important, but not central to some of the decisions that were being made. That's not surprising, as you can imagine. National interests, particularly security interests, at times have to trump near or short-term economic interests. Over time, of course, when you talk about economic cost of this getting prolonged, here at least, the India's macroeconomic numbers, I think, are there to support a more longer engagement. With $665 billion in foreign exchange reserves, which is like the fourth largest in the world after China, Japan, and Switzerland. It's with $5 trillion of stock market capitalization, like also fourth largest in the world. And inflation rate numbers that came in today at 3.1%, 6.2% of growth. All these macroeconomic numbers just go on to suggest that, clearly that we have the economic heft and forbearance to take on a longer engagement if necessary. Of course, there is a disparity, because the difference between, India is 10 times the Pakistani economy at this point. And over long term, would it have had an impact? If you looked at the way the financial markets behaved, for instance, there was hardly a noteworthy reaction while this was going on over the last 2 weeks. One reason for that is that the domestic institutional investors today in India hold as much investment in the markets and in the economy as foreign institutional investors. In fact, they've just overtaken the foreign institutional investors last week. So there is some resiliency in the investments and the way the economy is behaving. Of course, we are still an emerging economic power. We need capital, and adding geopolitical risk on top of climate risk and on top of labor risk and regulatory risk is going to be a difficult decision for any investor, domestic or foreign. But for the more immediate purposes, I think that certainly India had more depth and more resiliency if this had gone on a little bit longer. Incidentally, I just want to point out that the markets did actually have a largest gain yesterday, but they were to fall today, and the fall was nothing to do with the India-Pakistan tensions. It has to do with the US-China trade deal. Because the Indian economy thought that we might get the raw end of the deal if a bilateral agreement were to take place between US and China. So that's to indicate that the Indian economy is so integrated globally and is watching some of the global developments that I think that's become a larger and a more important signal for the resiliency of the economy and what is at stake.
Yeah, certainly this is happening at a time when global market volatility is at maybe an all-time high, given the uncertainty of the policy decisions coming out of Washington. So really important to remember that while multiple uh, trends and drivers of economics can be happening at once, a lot of the economic decisions that are being made because of that macro global economic situation and not necessarily because of political risk in the region. Farwa, I do want to come back on regional risk to you. So, given the centrality of the Indus Water Treaty, and particularly its use as a tool of leverage, or at least as a policy decision point in this latest escalation, what kind of risk do you see emerging if the mechanisms of that agreement break, or continue to be kind of suspended on and off during crisis moments? And then zooming out a little bit, um, you know, talk to us a little bit about what the implications are of India-Pakistan tensions for the development and economic regional security, economic prospects in South Asia for the smaller neighbors that are in the region.
Yeah, sure. So we've been reiterating today, like through the conversation, that the measure of putting the Indus Waters Treaty in abeyance is one of the most consequential moves we've seen in the trajectory of the India-Pakistan relations in decades, because it signals a rupture in what was once considered untouchable even during wars, enabling functional cooperation between the two countries over a shared life-sustaining resource. And now, even with the ceasefire, the treaty suspension remains. To just give a little bit of context, the Indus Waters Treaty was brokered by the World Bank in 1960. It is was so far considered one of the most resilient water sharing agreements in the world. It allocates control over six rivers of the Indus Basin, the eastern ones to India and the western ones to Pakistan, while imposing limitations on how India, as the upper riparian in this case, can use the western rivers. There is no provision within the treaty for unilateral withdrawal, and disputes are usually worked through a neutral expert or referring to an international court of arbitration. Now, by invoking a temporary suspension of the treaty, India has left the door technically open, but operationally, trust is deeply eroded. For Pakistan, this treaty is a lifeline, as its agricultural sector is heavily dependent on the Indus Basin. If hydrological data sharing is suspended, or if water releases are delayed or unannounced, it directly endangers millions of livelihoods downstream, particularly in the context of sort of the volatile monsoon season the country experiences and the increasing climate shocks. As for, this has come up a lot. As for can India divert or stop water? That is not possible in the short run, as India doesn't have the infrastructural capacity to do so yet. And such a capacity could take years to build. And of course, the resources involved in building these capacities are also massive. But what we do have to understand this here is that it's not a one-sided vulnerability. India too is downstream from rivers that originate in the Himalayas, where China, a close ally of Pakistan, controls headwaters, especially on the Brahmaputra River. So politicizing or weaponizing or securitizing water sets a very dangerous precedent in the region with other transboundary rivers that are not governed by any treaty. And that could very well come back to constrain the region's water security in the long term. So if formal dialogue was to resume, this should be one of the first agenda items on the road to resolve, given the large scale of socioeconomic, humanitarian, and political repercussions associated with it. Maybe there is a way to, for the current sort of DGMO level talks that have begun to factor this in. So there's some momentum, at least by the time we get to some sort of formal diplomatic um, dialogue between the two countries. Now, zooming out a little bit on the regional level, it's very important for us to remind ourselves that this conflict doesn't exist in a vacuum. In South Asia, where borders are porous but political ties are brittle, a serious military escalation between India and Pakistan doesn't just risk war, it freezes progress across the entire regional ecosystem. We've already seen how institutions like SARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, have become paralyzed, largely due to the India-Pakistan tensions over the past year. The regional potential for trade, energy, corridors, climate cooperation, they all remain largely untapped, and any conflict, particularly one with nuclear overtones, pushes that vision further out of reach and disrupts whatever little cooperation mechanisms that exist. As the ceasefire was announced, we saw neighboring Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, which had largely maintained a neutral stance through the escalation, hailing the ceasefire. It's primarily because these countries understand that stability in the subcontinent is essential to their own economic and growth prospects. And we don't want to get to a point where, you know, these countries, the smaller states in South Asia, are pushed to choose, pushed to align themselves one way or the other, which can compromise how they do economics, how they do sort of some of the other strategic geopolitical engagements with major countries within the neighborhood, but also other vested partners like China, for example. So that's again something where the international communities need to have a coherent, long-term, coordinated, sort of holistic South Asia policy becomes essential. So just stop there.
Great. Yes, thank you for that. It does seem as though, there's a great deal of desire and need for India and Pakistan to perhaps enter into some sort of formal talks, arrangements to at least manage bilateral relations in a new context, if not to, attempt a good attempt at resolving some of the underlying issues. Ambassador Munter, I would like to get your sense of the prospects for such talks starting. What do you think it would take for India and Pakistan to be comfortable, mutually comfortable, coming to the table together to discuss either, what has just currently happened, or to get in a little bit more detail on how to resolve some of the underlying issues? Do you think that there's any prospects for that at this point, or are we really looking at a waiting period or a period of positioning before those types of talks can happen? And we've spoken a little bit about the role of the US and how it's seen in the region. What do you think is like the ideal, from an India-Pakistan perspective, what is the ideal role of external powers in facilitating or supporting that type of bilateral engagement?
Well, I think one thing that Akshay has said, I want to dwell on this, the economic disparity that has grown between the two countries over the last decades. In many ways, I see this conflict as taking a form that is the same as previous forms of conflict, where when there is a terrorist attack, or along the lines of Mumbai or the previous kinds of tensions in Kargil and these kinds of things, where it is seen as a national security issue, and whether or not one has a military response or a military action, this back and forth. I'm not sure that will happen again. I'll go out on a limb and predict this. I think that what India is realizing, and what will be one of the lessons that I predict our Indian friends will draw, is to really take it into account just how much more powerful they are than Pakistan. Many Indian leaders have kind of bemoaned the idea that, I think someone used the phrase, we have tried to get rid of the hyphen in Indo-Pak for so many years, and now we're being put back in to this Indo-Pak kind of tension. I think India wants to put that behind themselves, and I would predict that India will now assess ways in which the overwhelming economic dominance that it has over Pakistan is the way in which it will deal with Pakistan. Not to say we will hit you militarily here and you hit us militarily there. That is to grow out of the traditional national security paradigm and begin to think, how do we make this work economically? Unfortunately, in my opinion, that makes it hard to imagine what would entice India to try to go into talks, to try to engage Pakistan. Pakistan, one could argue that Pakistan is doing a little bit better than it has done in the past economically, but the range of its problems and the range of its political difficulties and the inability of the political structures in Pakistan to move ahead economically are so great that I think it's going to be necessary to engage India if outside experts are going to engage India, they're going to have to do it in a way that takes into account the fact that India is an extraordinarily significant global player economically and not just another kind of sibling of Pakistan that has to be kind of calmed down by some parent. I think that's done. I think that's finished. The only question is whether the Americans, the Chinese, some of the other people in the region are creative enough to try to see this in an economic and broad way, taking into account what India is capable of doing. I think that the thing that makes me skeptical, I guess, about the progress of sitting down and really trying to solve these things is that it will take a little while for the leaders in both countries to assess how close they came to conflict and what they want to say. But I would imagine that the deeper lessons will be on the Indian side, that it doesn't have to play the game the way it's been played in the past. And if other countries can assess that, there may be a way to talk, but I guess that's a very long-winded way of saying I don't expect India and Pakistan to engage fruitfully anytime in the next few months.
Thank you for that. I think that's a realistic and sober assessment of growing Indian confidence in its abilities, in its role in the world stage, and its role in regional affairs. And it does call into question whether or not things have changed so much that is it still a tenet of, perhaps U.S. foreign policy and even, Chinese policy, Chinese regional policy, that Pakistan is too important to fail, and therefore, bring those powers into account in terms of, leveling or balancing India's substantial political and economic leverage against Pakistan. I think those are the types of developments we'll be following here at the Asia Society Policy Institute. And please stay tuned for more on that. You can follow us online at asiasociety.org, on our YouTube channel, across our social media channels, and we'll be sure to get this group back together as the developments unfold and continue to look at the role of India, Pakistan, regional players, and of course, major global players in addressing the crisis and in creating the terms and conditions where there might be peace and stability in the region. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and more soon.